Big Four Statutory Audit Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering statutory audit interview preparation used across Big Four audit teams. These questions reflect real interview patterns used in Big Four firms and global capability centers. Statutory audit focuses on audit risk assessment, ICFR reliance, substantive testing, materiality, analytics, documentation quality. Let's begin. How do you determine materiality levels for a new audit engagement? Sample answer. I start by understanding the company's size, business model, and key financial metrics. I select an appropriate benchmark, typically profit before tax, revenue, or total assets, depending on the entity's nature. I then apply professional judgment to set overall performance and specific materiality. I also define trivial thresholds and document qualitative considerations like lender covenants or regulatory sensitivity. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client has significant year-end revenue spikes. How do you test for cutoff errors? Sample answer. I analyze dispatch logs, invoice dates, revenue entries before and after year-end, and test samples for appropriate recognition. I tie back supporting documents like delivery challenge and customer acceptance. If controls appear weak, I expand substantive testing. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate whether ICFR controls are designed effectively? Sample answer. I walk through processes end-to-end, map key controls, assess whether risks are properly addressed, and identify gaps like lack of segregation or inadequate reviews. I validate with documentation and understand if automated controls are configured correctly. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. What procedures do you perform to assess management override of controls? Sample answer. I test journal entries for unusual patterns, review estimates for bias, analyze related party transactions, and check for override opportunities in access rights. I also examine approval trails and compare forecast accuracy to assess bias. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client has large cash transactions. How do you design audit procedures to test cash balances? Sample answer. I perform bank confirmations, reconcile statements, test cash counts, analyze unusual deposits/withdrawals, and check segregation of duties over cash handling. I also review large cash transactions for AML/fraud red flags. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you decide the extent of substantive testing versus reliance on controls? Sample answer. If controls are well designed and tested effectively, I rely on them to reduce substantive testing. If control risk is high, I shift to more detailed sampling, analytical procedures, and additional corroborative evidence. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A company's trial balance does not tie to the financial statements. How do you investigate? Sample answer. I reconcile TB to GL, GL to financials, identify mapping issues, test consolidation entries, and evaluate whether manual adjustments lack proper documentation. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. Statement. How do you identify high-risk areas during audit planning? Sample answer. I perform preliminary analytics, review prior audit findings, understand business changes, examine significant estimates, and note areas prone to fraud like revenue, inventory, and provisions. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client uses multiple ERP systems. How do you validate data migration controls? Sample answer. I evaluate pre- and post-migration reconciliations, test sample migrated records, review user access and change logs, and check if data mapping and cutover processes were governed properly. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you test revenue recognition for long-term contracts under Ind AS 115? Sample answer. I review contracts, identify performance obligations, test cost-to-cost calculations, validate inputs, and check revenue allocation and timing. I also test disclosures for adequacy. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A significant related party transaction arises during the audit. What steps do you follow? Sample answer. I identify the nature, verify approvals, test arm's length pricing, reconcile balances, and ensure proper disclosure. Unexpected related party activity increases fraud risk, so evidence needs to be strong. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you test valuation of inventory when multiple locations are involved? Sample answer. I attend counts across key sites, test standard costing or NRV calculations, review aging reports, and reconcile physical counts to books. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client has obsolete inventory. How do you verify adequacy of provisioning? Sample answer. I analyze aging, review sales post-balance sheet, compare to historical write-offs, and verify management assumptions. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. What procedures do you apply when confirming receivables with non-responsive debtors? Sample answer. I perform alternate procedures, subsequent collections testing, shipping documents, contracts, and customer communication review to validate existence. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A debtor circularization shows material differences. How do you reconcile discrepancies? Sample answer. I analyze reconciliation provided by management, test documentation supporting differences, and assess whether the discrepancy signals revenue cutoff or fictitious sales. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate reasonableness of an impairment test? Sample answer. I test assumptions like growth, discount rate, margins, compare against market benchmarks, and perform sensitivity analysis. I also review CGU allocation. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client capitalizes large repair expenses. How do you test appropriateness? Sample answer. I evaluate whether repairs create future economic benefit, review engineering reports, test documentation, and ensure capitalization policy is consistently applied. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. When testing payroll, what fraud indicators do you assess? Sample answer. I look for ghost employees, duplicate bank accounts, excessive overtime, unauthorized pay rate changes, and weak SOD between HR and payroll teams. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate going concern risks? Sample answer. I review cash flow forecasts, covenant compliance, funding lines, board minutes, and post-year-end events. Where risk is high, I increase testing and challenge assumptions. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client restates prior year financials. How do you update audit procedures? Sample answer. I reassess opening balances, test corrected entries, evaluate root cause, and update audit risk assessment accordingly. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you assess whether provisions under Ind AS 37 are adequate? Sample answer. I evaluate probability of outflow, legal assessments, historical claims behavior, and management estimates. I also reperform calculations where applicable. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you test fair value instruments? Sample answer. I evaluate valuation models, inputs, independent pricing, discount rates, and hierarchy classification. Complex instruments require deep corroborative evidence. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you perform analytical procedures during planning versus completion? Sample answer. Planning analytics identify unusual areas for deeper testing. Completion analytics validate overall statement consistency and highlight unexplained trends. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client refuses to provide audit evidence. What steps do you take? Sample answer. I escalate to senior management, revalidate requirements, consider alternative procedures, and assess whether limitation leads to modified opinion. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you determine whether a misstatement is material individually or in aggregate? Sample answer. I compare misstatements to materiality thresholds, assess qualitative factors, evaluate cumulative effects, and consider whether trends distort user interpretation. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. Here is part 2, question number 26 to 50. No intro saying Gallagher style, candidate style answers. And each answer ends with, while answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. Big 4 Statutory Audit, Interview Preparation, Part 2, Questions 26 to 50. A vendor confirmation indicates fictitious purchases. How do you verify authenticity? Sample answer. I check goods receipt notes, purchase orders, delivery documentation, and payment trails. I verify vendor, GST filings, cross-check bank details, and assess whether the vendor exists physically. If fraud indicators are strong, I expand testing and notify engagement leadership. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you test controls around user access and segregation of duties in IT systems? Sample answer. I review access listings, map roles to responsibilities, identify conflicting permissions, and inspect provisioning/deprovisioning workflows. I also test whether reviews are timely and if any high-risk access could lead to override. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client implements a new revenue software mid-year. How do you evaluate change management controls? Sample answer. I check whether UAT was performed, approval documentation exists, migration reports reconcile data, and whether access was controlled during go live. I test pre- and post-migration revenue samples. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you perform completeness testing for liabilities? Sample answer. I review subsequent payments, supplier statements, GRNs not yet booked, board minutes, bank payments, and legal correspondence. I also test Cutoff around year-end to identify unrecorded liabilities. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation, end quote. How do you evaluate classification of leases under Ind AS 116? Sample answer. I review lease agreements, assess whether contracts contain lease components, recompute ROU asset and liability, and analyze discount rates and modifications. I also check disclosures. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation, ... A company receives government grants. How do you test compliance and recognition? Sample answer. I verify grant conditions, check eligibility, review correspondence with authorities, and test whether recognition aligns with meeting performance obligations. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. Few troubleshooting required. How do you evaluate foreign exchange gain-loss treatment? Sample answer. I verify revaluation workings, check spot forward rates, test classification into realized versus unrealized, and ensure disclosure accuracy. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client delays post-year-end adjustments. How do you assess impact? Sample answer. I analyze pending adjustments, review management explanations, assess whether delays hide misstatements, and test subsequent events to quantify impact. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation, and ... How do you audit contingent liabilities disclosed in financial statements? Sample answer. I obtain legal confirmations, review case status, assess probability of outflow, and test management's judgment against past patterns or specialist inputs. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A major litigation is ongoing. How do you evaluate its financial statement impact? Sample answer. I read legal opinions, review correspondence, assess likelihood of loss, and ensure appropriate provision or disclosure under Ind AS 37. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you test consolidation workings for a company with multiple subsidiaries? Sample answer. I check line-by-line consolidation, test elimination of intercompany balances, validate minority interest, and reconcile subsidiary audits or management accounts. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A subsidiary's financials are audited by another firm. How do you assess reliance on their work? Sample answer. I evaluate their independence, review audit reports, understand key risks, and if necessary, perform additional procedures or request component auditor questionnaires. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate whether segment reporting complies with Ind AS 108? Sample answer. I check identification of operating segments, test consistency with internal reporting, verify reconciliations to consolidated numbers, and assess disclosures. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A company invests heavily in startups. How do you assess impairment and valuation? Sample answer. I check investment agreements, evaluate valuation models, assess whether indicators of impairment exist, and verify management assumptions with market data. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you verify completeness of related party disclosures? Sample answer. I review board minutes, contracts, statutory registers, GL scans, and compare against prior year disclosures to identify unrecorded relationships. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client significantly increases ECL this year. How do you test assumptions? Sample answer. I analyze aging buckets, test default rates, challenge provisioning matrices, check historical behavior, and evaluate macroeconomic overlays. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate the accuracy of GST reconciliations for revenue testing? Sample answer. I tie revenue to GSTR1, check mismatches, test reconciliation logic, validate GST turnovers, and investigate unexplained differences. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client has large intercompany transactions. How do you test accuracy and elimination entries? Sample answer. I match counterparty balances, reconcile transfer pricing adjustments, test elimination journals, and evaluate whether differences point to misstatements. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you perform cutoff testing for purchases and payables? Sample answer. I test GRNs, supplier invoices, and payments around year-end to ensure expenses and liabilities are recorded in the correct period. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A company has significant cash flow mismatches. How do you analyze cash flow statements? Sample answer. I reconcile cash flows to GL, analyze CFO versus EBITDA, test cash versus non-cash adjustments, and identify unusual working capital movements. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate adequacy of disclosures for key audit matters, CAMs? Sample answer. I identify high-risk areas, validate disclosures for clarity and completeness, check consistency with audit procedures performed, and ensure wording reflects actual risks. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation, etc. A fraud is detected during the audit. What reporting obligations do you have? Sample answer. I escalate to engagement partner, evaluate materiality, determine regulatory reporting requirements, document evidence, and modify audit opinion if necessary. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you review board minutes for audit risks? Sample answer. I scan for unrecorded liabilities, legal disputes, debt arrangements, strategic decisions, and risks that may require disclosures or provisions. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. A client makes frequent manual journal entries. How do you test for unusual postings? Sample answer. I run JE Analytics, filter for unusual timings, users, round amounts, revenue-related entries, and test samples with supporting documentation. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. How do you evaluate overall financial statement presentation before issuing the audit report? Sample answer. I perform final analytics, review disclosures for Ind AS compliance, check cross-references, tie numbers back to trial balance, and ensure the statements reflect fair presentation. While answering, always talk about audit risk, control reliance, evidence quality, documentation. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.